Essentially what I'm looking at right now in my source Google Sheet is a bunch of credit card customer data. So we have a client number, it's like a unique ID for the customer. And then we have a bunch of demographic data about the customer, like what their age is, their gender, their education level, marital status, income, the type of card they have, the number of months that they've been on the card, their credit limit, so on and so forth. So we have about 21 different columns with demographic and credit card spending data related to each of our customers. And how many customers do we have total in our sheet? We have 5,000 credit card customers. So this is a pretty good data set, and your data set might look similar to this in terms of many different columns with customer data. And we only have 5,000 rows here, but 5,000 does still seem kind of a lot. And we want to be able to filter this to just the data we need and then put this into a target, completely separate Google Sheet where we can kind of analyze the data ourselves so that we can do our own custom analysis or research or exploratory analysis, whatever that case may be. So the goal here is to take this data, and let's say we want to filter on the education level. So we only want to look at the customers that have a graduate degree. And then also we want to look in column H where the income is between $80,000 and $120,000. So essentially this list of 5,000 is going to get whittled down and filtered down to a list of about 200 or so. And we can filter this data in our current Google Sheet, but imagine this Google Sheet is like constantly being updated every day, and we want to put it into this separate Google Sheet in this tab I have opened here, which is called our target Google Sheet, if you will. And we want to basically find the customers that are graduates in their degree, and also they earn between 80K and 120K. So how do we pull that data from this source Google Sheet that has all the raw data into our target Google Sheet, which only contains the filter data that we need? Now, like I said before, we're going to be using the import range function. I'm going to create a new Google Sheet here, or a new sheet in my target sheet. And the first method I'm going to describe is kind of like a long way, but it's probably the most relatable way given the Google Sheet functions that we have available to us. And it's going to be involving the filter and index functions. So the first thing we want to do is we want to pull in the raw Google Sheet data. So I'm going to actually copy just the Google Sheet ID from our source raw data. You can copy the Google Sheet ID or the entire URL, it doesn't really matter. And in cell A1 of my sheet, my target sheet, I'm going to write equals import range, left parentheses, double quote, paste in that Google Sheet ID. And now I have to tell Google Sheets which columns I want to pull in from. I'm going to take all columns from column A colon to column U, because if you look back at my source Google Sheet, my source data goes from column A all the way to column U. So let's go back to my target, and all I've done here is set import range, left parentheses, double quote, the Google Sheet ID. You can also, again, put the full URL of your source Google Sheet here, comma, double quote, A colon U, double quote. So what I'm telling Google Sheets is take all my columns of data only from columns A through U and pull it from this Google Sheet, my source Google Sheet. If I hit enter, let's see what happens. Oop, I get a reference error. Let's see what's going on here. Did I do something wrong? Oh, nope, it's working like it's expecting to. And you can see here I have basically my entire data set, and it's all 5,000 rows, all 21 columns or so. And so that import range is working as it should. But now, how do I actually filter this data set so that I only get the customers with a graduate degree and income level of 80K to 120K? So if I look back at my Google Sheet, my source Google Sheet, my education level column, which is column F, that's the column that contains the, like, whether it's a graduate degree, high school, unknown, college, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's column 6 in my source Google Sheet, column F. The income category is column H. That's number 8, the 8th column in my source Google Sheet. And that contains things like 60 to 80K, 40 to 60K. And I'm only interested in the rows, the customers that are 80K to 120K. So basically, the customers that have a graduate degree and have a relatively higher income. So the key here is in my target sheet, instead of just doing a regular import range, I'm going to put a filter function outside of that import range. So filter left parentheses and import range. This first import range of my source Google Sheet, that's the first argument of the filter function. And then in my second argument, for my filter function, I'm going to write index left parentheses, and I'm going to again write import range again, and I'm going to copy and paste the same Google Sheet ID here into my second import range function here. So right now I have my second, as a second argument or parameter in my filter function, I have index left parentheses import range left parentheses double quote. I'm going to paste in my Google Sheet ID left double parentheses, and then comma columns A through columns U again, so the same exact kind of format of my first import range function, right parentheses, and then comma 0, comma 6. The reason why I put 0 and 6 because 0 is the row number and 6 is the column number. And so by saying this, I'm going to basically tell Google Sheets I only want to look at the 6th column in my source Google Sheet, which is my education level column. And then I'm going to write right parentheses to close out the index function. And then right here, there's where I write equals, double quote, graduate, double quote, and then right parentheses to close out the full filter function. If I hit enter, you'll see now that the data that has returned in my target Google Sheet is filtered. There's only 1,500 rows of data now, and everything in column F only shows graduate. So now I know my data has properly filtered to only show the customers that have a graduate degree in my target sheet. So anytime data is updated in this source customers data sheet, it will also get updated in my target sheet, but my target sheet only filters to customers with the graduate education level. We want to also look at the the customers that have an income of 80 to 120K. So what can I do with the filter function? You can just add additional conditions to your filter function. So I'm going to copy and paste this index import range function I just wrote and put a comma after the graduate. Just paste that whole index import range thing again. But this time I'm going to write, instead of 0, 6, 0, comma 6, I'm going to write 0, comma 8 as the second and third arguments in my index function. And then my second condition is going to be anyone that earns between 80K dash $120K. And let's hit enter here. Oh, I think I have to put one more closing parentheses here for my index, or my filter function. Hit enter. Oops, maybe I didn't do this. Maybe there's one too many. There we go. And let's take a look and see what happens here. And now I have a list of 294 customers that match this condition of graduate and 80K to 120K. So I filtered my list down to exactly what I need. Now the problem is, you can see I entered this formula into cell A1, but row 1 I actually want to show my headers for my data. Right now it's just going straight into the data in row 1. Now the problem is there's no easy way to filter, to have the data filter the data but also show the column headers. And so what I'm going to do is insert a blank row above row 1, and then I'm just going to go back to my source Google Sheet, copy and paste the column headers like this, copy C. So all my Google column headers from A1 through U1 in my source Google Sheet, put them in my target sheet from A1 to U1. And that's basically how I can have a sheet in my target sheet that has column headers and also has my filter data. So unfortunately here, my filter function has to start in cell A2 because I have to make room for the column headers in row 1. So this solution works. There are a lot of downsides to this solution, and then a few that I want to discuss right now basically are relating to efficiency. If you look at the function again, we're using a filter function on the outside, but we're running the import range function 3 different times. The first time is to just pull the data. The second and third times we're using the import range function to filter on certain columns, in this case column 6 and column 8 for my source data. Now this is super inefficient because we have to run an import range 3 times on the entire full data set from my source data. Imagine if I wanted to filter by 10 different columns in my source data. That's 10 different index import range functions you have to include in this filter function in order for you to properly filter your source data so that you only see the data that matters for you in your target Google Sheet. This is obviously not scalable for larger data sets, so I wouldn't really recommend this method unless you have a smaller data set and there's not too many conditions to filter on. The final con or final downside is you have to start this in cell A2, this formula. Remember how I had to put my column headers in row 1 and copy and paste? This is also subject to breaking because what if new columns of data get added to my source sheet? I have to remember to constantly copy and paste these column headers from my source Google Sheet into my target Google Sheet because those columns are not synced. Because these columns are hard-coded. They're not pulled in with the import range function. Now, there are some hacks you can do to use the import range function to pull in your column headers and then have row 2 being the starting point for your actual data. But I'm not going to get into that now because it does get a little bit hacky. But this is a solution using, basically the filter and index functions along with the import range function to do kind of a filtering of data that you might be used to doing just if all this data was in one Google Sheet. Well, we want to do a better solution than this and hopefully more efficient one. And this is the preferred solution that I like to use, which doesn't involve the filter function. I'm just going to delete all my data for now from this empty sheet. And it's going to be the query function, which I've talked about in previous episodes on the podcast. So I'm going to write query in cell A1 here, left parentheses. And I'm going to do the same import range function I've done in the past in the first method, import range, left parentheses. Go back and copy my spreadsheet URL or just the sheet ID in this case so I can make it more readable. So double quote, paste in the Google Sheet ID, double quote, and then also double quote, columns A through columns U, double quote, and that's going to be my import range function as the first argument in my query function. Remember the query function, the first argument, first parameter, just like the filter function, is just your entire data set. So that's just going to be everything from my source Google Sheet from columns A through U. So that's my first parameter. Now, comma, what do I do for my second parameter? Now, this is where you have to do a little bit of SQL writing into Google Sheets, which may be a little bit unknown to folks, but this one is going to be super simple, relatively simple compared to other SQL queries. I'm going to write double quote, select, and this is where you tell Google Sheets which columns you want to pull in into your target Google Sheet from your source. So I'm going to pull in just the columns 1. So you do select space col once, capital COL 1, capital COL 3, so col 3, col 6, col 7, col 8, column 9. So I have columns 1, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns I'm pulling from my source sheet. Then I write space where col 6 equals single quote graduate, single quote, and col 8 equals, single quote, 80K dash 120K, single quote. And then this is the most important part of the query function, is putting a comma 1, and that 1 basically tells, oops, I have to put a double quote around my select statement, double quote. Then I write comma 1, and that 1 basically tells Google Sheets my first row in my query function contains a header. So I'm just going to put a 1 there, and then I'm going to put right parentheses, hit enter, and you'll see the same list of data that we had in our first method, only 294 rows of data, 295 rows of data, filtered down from my source sheet that has 5,000 rows. But my target sheet only shows the customers with the graduate education level, as well as the income category of 80K to 120K. Now the big difference here, you'll notice, is that I only have 6 columns of data from my source Google Sheet. And that's because with the query function, you can specify which columns you want to pull into your Google Sheet. Whereas with the previous method, the filter method, you have to pull in every single column of data from your source Google Sheet, which is kind of cumbersome because now if you don't want to see all these columns, you have to hide those columns and they're taking up space in your Google Sheet. It's just not a very scalable solution. So that's why I really like this query option, this query function, because you can specify which columns you want, and those get pulled into your Google Sheet. So this is like the most compact view of the data that just matters for you. And now I can do some more custom analysis on just these 6 columns of data that matter for me. I like this function. I like this solution also because the formula is a lot shorter and a little bit easier to understand. You're just dealing with the query function and the import range function. There's no filter or index. Now the downside, of course, is the query function is a relatively hard function to learn. And if you're trying to do some complicated filtering and sorting in your query function, this will definitely require some more SQL knowledge, which I know a lot of analysts may not have that skill level yet. So learning some SQL might help if you want to use the query function for more advanced use cases. Now, similar to the previous solution, this solution with the query function is also a little bit weak because you have to know exactly which columns you want to pull in. I only knew these columns, column 1, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, was because I did this before, but they correspond to the specific columns in my source Google Sheet. So you have to count which columns you actually want to pull in, kind of like you would do a VLOOKUP formula. And again, the problem is if your columns get added or subtracted in your source Google Sheet, you have to readjust the column numbers in your target Google Sheet. So this downside kind of puts it at the same level as the first solution. But the benefit is that you can pull in just the columns that matter for you without having to worry about like 50 different columns that don't really matter for your data set. So these are the 2 methods you can use to use the import range function to pull data in. I prefer the query function because it's much easier to write and look at, but it does require a little bit of SQL knowledge. And if you don't know some SQL, this might be a harder function to pick up. So going back to the original hypothesis of all our data is most likely going to be in Google Sheets, and we just have to come to accept this. There's many unconventional uses of Google Sheets. I think using your Google Sheets as a database that's containing business critical data is of course not a best practice, but the sooner that you can accept the fact that your team, your company will have some type of business critical data in Google Sheets or Excel, the faster you can start finding these workarounds like what I showed here to pull data out into another Google Sheet so that you can do the analysis that matters for you, knowing that your target Google Sheet will stay updated and refreshed when your source Google Sheet that contains all the company's important data, when that gets updated. So that's the nice thing about using the import range function within the Google Sheets ecosystem. So that's going to be